Kia ora, folks. Well, enough people asked for this. I thought I would record it. This is a talk on an integral approach to faith, and it's really a story of where I've got to thus far and how an integral approach to faith has helped me make sense of the world. I'm also going to be doing a part 2 this coming Sunday on how an integral approach could help churches and societies, and I'll look at a couple of case studies when I do that. So first, just a couple of caveats. I'm a 43-year-old Pākehā male, and that's kind of obvious, but I want to make explicit that I'm assuming that I'll keep growing and learning in my faith, and that many other people have got other faith perspectives and wisdom that go beyond mine. I'm also assuming and want to be explicit about the fact that this is my perspective, this is where I've got to, and I'm sharing this with the Cityside community and or beyond as part of a desire to be open and transparent about my own journeying, in the hope that that may be of use, but it doesn't need to define exactly anybody else's journey. So, I have always understood life to be a dynamic journey, and this passage from 1 Corinthians kind of captures that. This sense of growing, the sense that there is more, and as we grow up, there's more to understand. And I've been inspired by that kind of question that my father-in-law always asks, which is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And as I'm coming to realize, there are many nuggets of wisdom in Scripture, and when you circle around them again, you read them with a new perspective, and they speak afresh again. And this is one of those nuggets. So, I guess I would characterize my kind of growing up, and this is in hindsight with that clarity that you get after the fact, as a fairly Trinitarian experience. I certainly wouldn't have used that term when I was growing up, but there was a 3-part sort of experience of faith. Relationship with Jesus was pretty paramount. I had a really strong sense of the creation as a context for God, the Creator, and that was a really energizing thing, still is for me. And the kind of experience of the Holy Spirit was a real part of my growing up, and that's where most of the interesting and challenging questions kind of were. But I had a pragmatic kind of don't get too carried away with anything too much sort of a context that I was living in, and that kept me at least somewhat engaged in ordinary life through music and various other friends and things. But I knew who my tribe was at this time. So the culmination of that context for growing up was what became a stumbling block for me in the end, in sort of the first part of my life. I guess this diagram captures that worldview, and that's built on Romans 6:23, which was something that was drilled into me when I went on to become a professional Christian, a missionary in North Africa. I had been a very performance-focused person, and this was kind of the pinnacle of the professional Christian life. And I can still recite 6:23 Romans in Arabic. And at the time, we used to sort of say it as if it would magically compel anyone listening to accept Jesus. But what traveling does is powerfully transformative, and I guess I built relationships in that year. They might have been transient and relatively shallow ones, but they had some reality for me and with the Muslim people that I was living with and hanging out with. And it became really obvious that there was just as deep a sense of love, of faithfulness, of honor, of right living, of wisdom amongst these people who had been well outside my tribe according to the beliefs that I had held to at the time. And in fact, when I was looking for this picture, I didn't remember that on the back of it was this incredible loving message from these guys at the hotel in Egypt that I spent this time with. And that's just I guess a bit of a reflection on the reality that, I came into contact with some experience that was different to what my beliefs had led me could be sort of possible. Now, it sort of seems to happen in life. We develop in different ways at different times. And while my faith had provided the overall shape to my worldview up to that time, I'd been engaging intellectually with a bunch of insights from psychology, which I'd studied at university in the years prior to traveling to North Africa. And These are pretty compelling, but they're quite focused in scope, and the way that they excluded spiritual experience meant that they were never really very compelling as a total worldview. So obviously Freud made an enormous contribution to our understanding of how we behave, and his focus on the sources of pleasure that we have and the motivation that seeking pleasure causes was pretty compelling, and really the first contribution to, I guess, psychology looking at stages of development. The second key theorist is Erikson, who has this psychosocial set of stages, and these focus on a key conflict that people need to resolve at certain points in their life if they are to successfully move on to the next stage. And you can see some of these are really insightful, looking at, for example, adolescence with identity versus confusion, and if you resolve that, you get a sense of complexity and an understanding of how aesthetics works. And for example, in old age, the contrast between those who find integrity and those who find themselves in a place of despair. Other theorists, such as Kohlberg, who looked at the way that we develop morally from just avoiding a punishment sort of orientation to what are the rules to be a good person, to a much more internalized universal ethics approach. And also, many people will have come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you need to satisfy those basic needs at the bottom before you move up to satisfying the safety needs, and then the belongingness and love needs, and then with motivation towards succeeding and esteem needs, and eventually achieving your potential, including creative things. So these were really helpful, insightful, and quite compelling, but they were also very partial and focused. I also came across the first sort of places where spiritual growth was discussed, reading Scott Peck, The Road Less Travelled, and his 4 stages of faith development, going again from that punishments through to a kind of a rule-based understanding. And then his key sort of insight is that as young adults and adolescents, we rebel against that, and we challenge that, and then we have to kind of gather that back in again and consolidate it into some kind of a more open-ended focus. And that's really built on Fowler's stages of faith, which is a slightly more sophisticated understanding of how faith might develop through the need for concrete symbols and strong beliefs in a certain rule-based universe with a deity, where then you might break that down again and make it a bit more reflective and internalize it to your own set of truths that you buy into instead of an externally imposed set, all the way up to a kind of a universalized understanding of the cosmos. So these theories I'd kind of been grappling with. They're all separate, they're helpful in their own domain, but the holistic faith of my childhood and adolescence had really held together in the face of these theories. But when I had that experience in North Africa, it kind of pulled that apart, and I needed to come to a place of finding something else that would actually ground how my faith worked. And I came to that in the work of Chris Marshall, and I'm indebted to him. I studied at Bible College in New Zealand in a couple of papers, and this was one of them. And his concept around the kingdom of God was for me a brand new paradigm, a brand new understanding of what the point of Christian faith was like. It was a very significant basis of faith for me that really replaced the atonement theory based stuff that I grew up with. Here was a way to engage fully with the now and with all kinds of people. It's based solidly on the Bible and its theology, and it doesn't have the, what had become sort of embarrassing deficiencies to me. In this framework, it's big enough to integrate my thinking, my lived experience, as well as my ideas that I'd come across in education. And you can see in the way that, for example, this is the key terminology of Jesus' teaching. It's something that Jesus was passionate about, but there's a very dynamic sense to the understanding of what the kingdom is. It's partly here, but it's not yet fully here, and we need to engage in working towards it. It's the power and the sort of role of the impact of God, or the reign or the rule or the kingship of God. And when we're working towards this, we are working in alignment with what Jesus was teaching, and in alignment with the building of God's influence on the earth. And look, there's even a bit of room for other faiths in there, because it's not primarily about believing a certain set of transactions has happened. It's about what you are doing and how you're aligning with God. Although those beliefs from other places need to actually fit into a kingdom framework for that to be the case. Now, equipped with this more fit-for-purpose framework in life, I then began to feel free to take a deeper interest in the ways that people from different backgrounds seem to be converging in their attempts to make sense of the world. I was involved in teaching a course called Theory of Knowledge. It's a kind of a cut-down epistemology, how do we know things, and it left room for faith as a way of knowing. Just looks at the place of the knower, the ways we know things, and the areas of knowledge. I also came across the idea of equilibrium. John Ralston Saul wrote this book, and this essentially argues that there's 6 approaches to knowledge that we have, especially knowledge about God, and that Western culture has really over-capitalized or over-depended on rational thinking, and we've got a little bit out of balance. We've lost our trust in common sense and intuition and imagination. Another really helpful idea coming out of a theological point of view was Leslie Newbegin's proper confidence. This is the place where I first got my head around the idea that actually you didn't have to be certain about something to be confident in it, and that faith was not really about being certain. It was about having confidence in something, but being open to learning and to change. And that to me seemed a much more healthy way to understand the whole dynamic of faith. I also was really intrigued at some of the insights of quantum physics. Maybe entanglement is a mechanism for prayer. Maybe words of knowledge are a reflection of synchronicity in the universe at a quantum level. Maybe supernatural intuition and experiences can be explained by quantum connections. Now, this stuff is, again, fairly esoteric in some ways, but it was interesting to me that people in physics were starting to explore these kinds of phenomena, which up until that point I hadn't seen any kind of scientific explanation of them. I also really got a lot out of the work of Ken Gergen. Ken Gergen's a sociologist who did a lot of work on the impact of the mass media and social media on our sense of self, and argued that different from Descartes' I think therefore I am, our sense of who we are is actually being changed and made impossible by the world that we live in. We are overloaded by media and imagery. We consume it, we produce it. Our identity is no longer secure in one individual place. We in fact project our identity in multiple ways and have our identity projected on us by many others, and therefore our identity becomes relational. I am, for example, a husband, a father, an employee, a leader. I am embedded in us, and I'm not separable. So all these threads were really inspiring and energizing, kind of connected to each other in some ways, but still partial in scope. And so that Kingdom of God framework was my main framework for this portion of time. Now, if we move on, I wanted to appreciate the work and the things that I had gained from being at Cityside, and obviously the Enneagram is one of those things, and there's a number of things that I really appreciate from my time at Cityside. So the Enneagram, the work of Richard Rohr on order and disorder and reorder, that's sort of echoing the Scott Peck approach to spiritual growth and some of Fowler's stuff. His work on the second half of life and letting go of ego, or on the cosmic Christ, this idea that we have conflated Jesus of Nazareth with the Christ who is cosmic and eternal, and by putting those names together we've lost sight of the fact that Christ is cosmic, the knowable face of God. So Raw's diagram here about the way that Jesus brought these two aspects of God together, and we, instead of seeing him as a kind of unique magical superhuman, he's actually an example, or the example, of how the cosmic Christ could be aligned in a person. Really inspiring. Also, some of the stuff that we've done here in this community around various exotic historical links, looking at Syriac Christianity, or the way that Sufi Islam and the Desert Fathers interacted perhaps, or the way that Buddhist travelers might have interacted, the way that the Jewish Kabbalah and Mishnah traditions of reinterpreting the truth for each generation all play a role in understanding how our faith is developed. All of this has been very stimulating and interesting and life-giving. The Orthodox emphasis on original blessing instead of original sin, that was a massive mind bender for me. Again, moving away from and leaving behind, I guess, that atonement-based idea that actually creation started out with this sense of original sin, and the Orthodox approach on understanding the Bible as wisdom literature, where original blessing is the right way for us to live, and sin is just what's gone wrong since. So Cityside has been a place where lots of wonderful things, including contemplative practice, have really inspired me and helped me to keep developing my faith, keep growing. So some of these things are practices, and some of these things are not just head knowledge, but at the same time, your head knowledge is affected by practice, and so it's been interesting to see how that's grown too in this time. And I'm indebted to Ali for this map of the different Christian denominations. You can see the big Catholic thread in the middle there, and down in the eastern half of the diagram, the Orthodox parts of the church, and in the top half you've got the various Protestant denominations and when they split off, and somewhere in there there's a tiny little arrow for Cityside coming off the Baptist thread. My identity was kind of beginning to separate from these groupings as I engaged with thinkers in the world and put together the practices of contemplative work. And I guess it was sped up by a rude shock that I gained at Baptist Assembly. I tried to use my Baptist whakapapa to contend for a more open faith, and I realized that the Baptist movement is mostly made up of folks who operate according to that atonement model that seemed to me to be something that I had left behind many years ago. It seemed to me that a faith position really needed to get past all these tribal identities. And so really, if I'm honest, I feel that, increasingly this is where I'm at now, that a faith position needs to be able to get past all of the different religious identities, and it needs to be able to transcend and include wisdom from them all. And this is a map of all the different world's religious traditions. You can see Christianity in the kind of light green center left there. That's very different from finding a way to reconcile all their truth claims, which isn't possible, but understanding how they've developed and living authentically on that basis certainly is. So this has kind of become a goal for me, is how can I actually transcend all of this? It's so diverse and so hugely challenging, and yet there seem to be pointers of unity in various places. And this is where we get to, I guess, the integral focus of this talk. I came across this framework a few years ago, and I found it quite compelling, but I also found it quite distasteful. It claims to integrate pretty much all of the models I've referred to in the talk, and sort of intellectually it does. I still find Ken Wilber's writing a little bit arrogant, and I find it hard to get past some of his "my theory's bigger than your theory" approach. But this set of ideas has really helped me relax about many matters that I previously struggled with, and it's allowed me to focus on being in the world as I am and as it is, rather than being preoccupied with obligations and beliefs about what I and others should do. So the fruit seems good so far, and I'll have a go at a brief explanation of this. And in the next part of the talk, I'm going to have a go at exploring how this approach might help us make sense of the world as it is, looking at some case studies of churches and society. So if we take a look at the bottom right corner here, you can see the lines of development, and these really are his lining up of many of those different theories that I've referred to. So we all develop on certain lines, moral, cognitive, psychosocial, spiritual, creative, and there's a bunch of ways that we develop, and there are some commonalities with different stages of that. Moving up to the top right, we can also try to understand how the world is in a bunch of different ways. We can look at the internal individual, the I, and try and explore how our own sense of self works. We can look externally at the individual in a more objective sense, in the scientific approach, looking at the brain and empirical understandings of behavior and neurology is part of that. We can look at the group. Internally, we look at culture and worldview and how we make meaning together, and how community and organizations and politics all works. And we can look externally at the group, looking at systems and economics and various ways of looking at the ecology of the world. So it's intended that you could use this integral map to do any of those kinds of explorations. And so when we talk about the overall altitudes of development, which is the contribution of the integral map, and that's in that central column there, those descriptors are a kind of a meta theory that you could use in any of those four scopes: the individual interior or exterior, the group interior or exterior, and you could look at it in any of the lines of development. You can also look at the different states of consciousness that we have, and this draws on Christian and Buddhist and other kinds of religious understandings, as well as looking at scientific work on dreams and these kinds of things. And all of that is integrated into the altitudes that are there. Now I'm going to very briefly look at, on the left hand side here, some values systems which are similar to the integral altitudes of development, but they come from a group of theorists who are known as the spiral dynamics theorists. And I guess there's two insights here. One is that we develop through various value systems. The other is that we circle around, and some of the issues that we struggle with, we come back again into later life and have a different understanding of them. So just briefly looking at the stages of development from spiral dynamics, there's a sense in which we start with an instinctive understanding of the world, where you do what you must to stay alive. And then from that comes a kind of a magical understanding of the world, where you're keeping the spirits happy and you believe in fairies and magic, and possibly there's good ones and bad ones. That grows into a power self, where you figure out that if you have some skill or ability or power, you can make your way in the world. And this is where the kind of warrior, the power and the glory and the people pushing for achievement, that all comes from. Then we have the kind of rule-based self, and that's where you get the self that believes in the system, the justice of the rules that nations and societies agree on, and there's a sense in which your tribe and your people need to all play by the rules, and it's important for people to do so. So it's a very orderly sort of emphasis. Coming out of that, we have the rational self, I guess, playing the philosophical, playing devil's advocate and applying rationality to some of these things, pointing out that sometimes rules don't make sense, and in fact that things should be done differently. There's a quest to create a better life through logic, reason. Science is a very big part of this. Coming out of the rational self, we get to the sensitive self, which is, I guess, an emphasis on relationship and an emphasis on power with solidarity, human rights, care for the planet, various other kinds of things. And then above that level, the integral and the holistic self, where there's a first sort of point at which there's a real understanding of all of the other stages, and a sense of yourself as part of the human species, a sense that you can integrate the strengths and weaknesses of the different stages. Now, most of us spend most of our lives living in the sort of power, rule, role, rational, and maybe the sensitive self. And I think only in our best moments do we make it up into that integral part, and only a few people live there most of the time. So the spiral dynamics approach to development is similar to the integral approach. I won't make all the distinctions here. Suffice to say that it's an important contributing theoretical framework, and it integrates relatively well. But the altitudes in the center of this diagram are the thing that we're going to be focusing on next week when we look at the integral altitudes of development and how they help us to understand life, faith, and the way the world is. Thank you very much.